Good afternoon. Welcome to TouchNet podcast. My name is Sad Torcalo. Today I'm sitting down with His Excellency Julian Reilly, United Kingdom's Ambassador to Bosnia and Hercegovina. Ambassador Reilly has been in Sarajevo since July 2022, meaning he has been at the center of what many are calling the most serious constitutional crisis in this country since the Dayton Peace Agreement. In the past 3 years, we have seen a criminal conviction, a removal from office of a sitting entity president, attempted arrests, a draft secessionist constitution. We have a lot to discuss. Ambassador Reilly, welcome to TouchNet.
Thank you very much. Pleasure to be here.
Ambassador, you arrived in Sarajevo in July 2022. Before that, you had served in Moscow, in the Horn of Africa, and on the Western Balkans desk at the FCO. When you look back at the past 3.5 years, was this posting what you expected?
I'm not sure one's ever quite sure what one's going to get on a posting, but it definitely lived up to my expectations. I had done all kinds of different kinds of work over the past. I've never had what some people would call an easy posting. I've had some fascinating postings in Sudan, in different bits of East Africa, in North Africa, in Saudi Arabia, in Russia, as you mentioned. This has been a really delightful and enjoyable post from a personal point of view, and professionally very challenging and interesting. And I dare say you'll be asking me a little bit more about that in due course.
I mean, that's the reason why I asked it. You served in Moscow during the Medvedev-Putin transition. You were in Sudan during some very difficult moments. Where does Bosnia rank in terms of this intensity, what you have dealt with?
It's always intense in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Bosnia and Herzegovina does not have the most challenging problems in the world, but it has an incredibly complex constitution. It has a very complex post-conflict environment which affects day-to-day politics, perhaps more than it should, but it's a fact that it does. And although every country is different and each job throws up new challenges, I think actually I was able to bring experience from my previous post, which actually I found very useful in the very different environment that Bosnia and Herzegovina is. But actually there are commonalities, because actually we're all people. And if you've worked in other countries, I worked in Sudan, for instance, on the Comprehensive Peace Agreement more than 20 years ago now. Or I've been engaged with Iran a long time ago as well, working on very complex negotiations. So how negotiations work, how people's experiences as they go into a negotiation, how you help people who've disagreed, including violently in the past, how you bring them to compromises and solutions and facilitate that, because you can only facilitate as a foreigner, is, I think, it's really interesting to see how that is very different in each place, but also actually how the human factor means there's a huge amount of commonality as well. And I hope I'm able to bring that sort of 30 years of experience to working here in Bosnia and Herzegovina.
And speaking about your experience, does that experience change how you read what's happening in this country? You spent 4 years in Moscow. When you see Russian flags at rallies in Banja Luka, or when Dodik visits Putin days after an arrest warrant, does your Moscow experience give you a particular lens?
Probably, yes, because I recognize what's going on, because none of this is new, and I see different things. Sometimes I see laws, the saga of the NGO laws or whatever, and I think, oh, I've seen that model before. I watched it happen 15 years ago somewhere else. I know what the storyline is. I'm also perhaps conscious of the profound, perhaps almost existential challenge that we face, which is manifest most obviously and tragically in Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and the war going on there, but the way that that impacts on the whole of Europe's security, and how Bosnia-Herzegovina is fundamentally impacted and part of that story, and therefore how different politicians, different views can be instrumentalized on either side of that debate, and how careful one has to be, and actually how it is in the United Kingdom's interest to work with all of our partners, including in Bosnia and Herzegovina, to make sure that not only to shore up the security of Bosnia and Herzegovina, but also actually shore up European security, because my experience from previously makes me very much aware of the threats which exist from that kind of engagement.
You mentioned this experience with how NGOs or civil society treated in some of the countries you were previously serving as diplomat. And you're speaking today to touch on it, a portal founded in Mostar by Štefca Galić, a woman who saved lives during the war and who has been under protection because of threats against her. We are an independent outlet in a country where media freedom is under, I would say, enormous pressure, particularly in entity Republika Srpska. From a diplomat's perspective, what does independent media mean for country's future?
An independent media is absolutely fundamental for a democratic future in which actually every citizen can grow. I agree that there are huge barriers to the growth of independent media in Bosnia and Herzegovina. I would actually say across the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina for different reasons. I think when so much of the media landscape is affiliated with particular political views or parties, it's clearly very difficult for independent media to operate in the spaces, particularly when funding is a challenge. Bosnia and Herzegovina is not a big country, so there is not a huge amount of automatic revenue that's going to come. And then if you just look at how difficult it is just to get self-sustaining, challenging media that hold governments to account at every level, that's really difficult. And it's really important that there needs to be steady streams of funding. And I long for the day when we see that funding is domestically raised, because at that point you have a genuinely democratic society in which the whole political makeup is supporting that challenge. No government likes being criticised, but no government is good unless it is criticised.
Let me take you back to February 26th last year. Milorad Dodik is convicted by the court of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That same evening he tells a rally that Bosnia and Herzegovina no longer exists. In the days that followed, the RS National Assembly banned state judicial institutions from operating on its territory, expelled some opposition's MPs from the chambers, and adopted a secessionist constitutional draft. You said at the time that the court verdict must be fully respected. Looking back, was the international response to that moment fast enough and decisive enough?
I think the key point is to look at where we are now, and the court rulings have been upheld. The laws were withdrawn, those laws which had already been deemed unconstitutional by the Constitutional Court. And it's interesting also to see that the Constitutional Court's rulings have not only been eventually obeyed, despite the rhetoric, but sometimes preempted in decisions which have been made subsequently. I take that as a positive sign that actually the state is perhaps more respected or feared than the rhetoric would imply. You ask about the international community's response. We, I think, were clear about constitutionality, and we stood very firmly behind the principle of backing up the domestic institutions to fulfill their functions. And actually the point is that the domestic institutions did fulfill their functions. So while it is true that at the time there were lots of people calling for urgent international action, I think actually the fact that what has happened has been driven by state institutions performing their functions has strengthened Bosnia and Herzegovina. I do think it was very important that the international community was absolutely clear that we stood behind those state institutions and were ready to back them up. But I'm really, really pleased that actually the systems worked. They were tested, but they worked.
Just a few more questions related to the RS. Dodik is gone from formal office, but Sinša Karan, who is his hand-picked successor, a former police intelligence chief, won the RS presidential election and has pledged to continue Dodik's policies with ever greater force. Several of the laws have been formally annulled, but the political infrastructure that produced them is intact. My question is quite simple. Has anything fundamentally changed?
I think the first thing to say is that there is a fundamental difference, which is Mr. Dodik is no longer the president of Republika Srpska. I was very pleased with Dame Karen Pierce, our special envoy last week, to have what was in fact my first ever meeting with a head of the Republika Srpska government. And there are many things on which we may not agree. But actually we were able to have a positive conversation about the policy issues. And I think there the key thing is that the United Kingdom set out our absolute commitment to the sovereignty and integrity and security of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and we're very, very clear that in supporting the Dayton Peace Agreement, we supported a single country made up of two entities with three constituent people and others, so that constitutional position was there, and we're able to have a conversation on the back of that. Of course, I think another thing which has changed is that it was a very close run election for the President of Republika Srpska, and I think political plurality in both entities is massively important to actually create political debate which is around issues related to the economy, related to social standards, how do you keep young people here, create jobs for them, etc. Move a conversation towards those social and economic issues and away from this post-conflict, ethnically based rhetoric. And I have to say that it has been extremely disappointing to, and indeed unacceptable, to hear some of the unconstitutional, anti-democratic, Islamophobic rhetoric which we have been hearing lately. It's not for me to speculate why that is occurring, but of course 2026 is an election year, and there has been far too long a tradition, and I talk about the whole of Bosnia and Herzegovina here, of remembering ethnic division at a time of election in order to move away from the fact that maybe there hasn't been as much progress on the real life issues like creating jobs, building hospitals and all the rest of it, which is what people would really like to see. I think it's really important to remember that Republika Srpska is made up of a lot of different people and a lot of different political parties. And even if you just look at the Republika Srpska opposition, I'm hearing very different messages. So for instance, I'm hearing more and more often we want to see a strong Republika Srpska in a strong Bosnia and Herzegovina on a Euro-Atlantic path. Now, there may be certain members of individual parties who are not coming out with that and would rather have a conversation which is about this ethnicity against that ethnicity, or and undermining others, or trying to provoke others through rhetoric into coming out to say that there is no need to focus on those other issues. But I do think that we are seeing, and I think the election result, which was incredibly close, showed that there is an interest in a range of different views. And you asked me specifically about Republika Srpska, but actually I think that we need to look at both entities and the whole of the country and look at what citizens are asking for, and also look at what maybe is not being delivered to them by the current political leadership. And on that, I would just reflect, for instance, the many billions of euros and pounds and dollars which are being denied in terms of investment because of key problems which have been around for a long time, which are not being addressed in the political fora where they should be addressed to find solutions, which is impacting on the well-being and the welfare of ordinary people.
A few words about the sanctions. In October 2025, the United States lifted all sanctions on Milorad Dodik and 47 other individuals and entities. And the British embassy responded by saying, and I'm quoting, "Once the reasons for imposing the sanctions are removed, the United Kingdom can lift them. Until then, we have nothing to talk about." And understand that UK has an autonomous sanctions regime, but the practical effect of the US lifting sanctions was immediate. BiH state prosecutors suspended their investigations, RS lobbying firms were paid over $1 million a year, and Dodik himself visited Washington. The UK sanctions cover only two individuals, Željka Cvijanović and Milorad Dodik, and both of them say that they do not have any assets in Britain. So I have to ask, what is the actual leverage of UK sanctions at this point? Are they a policy tool or just a symbolic gesture?
They're a policy tool. If they had no value, I would not expect to be receiving pressure to have them lifted. And I think what we said back in October, which you just quoted, I think lines that we have heard this week underline exactly why that was the right position to take, and remains so.
And when I discuss the British policy towards the Western Balkans and towards Bosnia and Hercegovina, many of my colleagues, they often highlight or emphasize the fact that in this post-Brexit time, UK is actually very strong focused on the Western Balkans. And your country left the European Union, then withdrew from EU4. Your own House of Lords committee called that decision a signal of downgraded engagement. Now the UK encourages Bosnia and Herzegovina to join the EU, a club that Britain itself chose to leave. How do you explain that to a Bosnian citizen without sounding contradictory? It was a question that Dane Karen was asked last week as well, funnily enough. And it's not a difficult question to answer. The United Kingdom left under, it was a democratic will of the people of the United Kingdom. We have a very different sort of historical and economic context. Our position on the movement of the Western Balkan countries towards the European Union is based not on where we are, but on where those countries are, including Bosnia and Herzegovina. An overall plurality of Bosnian citizens very much want to join the European Union. It is the policy of this country to do that. It is absolutely clear that with that being the popular will, and if you just look at the statistics, so the benefits that EU membership has brought to other countries in the wider region. So a statistic worth reflecting on is I believe that the economies of Romania and Bulgaria have grown 6 times in the 20 years since that they joined. I think the most successfully expanding economy
in the Western Balkan region is Serbia's, which is slightly just over doubled in 10 years. But you begin to see that actually that EU membership really brings benefits. The other thing I would reflect on is the citizens of this country vote with their feet. There's an awful lot of, there's a big diaspora in the European Union. Clearly finding it a pleasant place to live and work. But also actually when I talk to people who've come back to Bosnia and Herzegovina, because if I'm amazed as I travel around, I'm not amazed, I'm just pleased actually to hear how many people have returned to Bosnia and Herzegovina when they can and when they have a good business model that they can actually survive on. And they bring those practices back, but obviously they would do better in business terms and social terms if Bosnia and Herzegovina was a member of the European Union, and they would build on that. So for the United Kingdom, it's a really easy argument to make because it's actually about prosperity for the citizens of this country.
As pointed out, the British diplomacy is still deeply present in the Western Balkans. And what is the UK's comparative advantage? What can London do that Brussels cannot do?
I think it's true to say that we can think as one of one, and we can act as one of one. So we're a voice which merely has to have consensus with itself, which helps. But actually, I don't think it's a competition. It's actually about partnership. It's, you know, I sit on the steering board of ambassadors, which of course includes the EU and the United States and some non-European countries, some countries outside the European Union, including us. So there are different groups in the international community who can support Bosnia and Herzegovina in different ways. The United Kingdom, obviously, as members of the PIC steering board, we play a significant role there. We continue to engage very deeply, for instance, on defence reform, and as members of NATO, but also bilaterally supporting Bosnia and Herzegovina's alignment with NATO standards, building on defence reform. We have had members of the armed forces of Bosnia and Herzegovina sort of join us in peacekeeping missions in the past, and I hope we will in the future. So there's that set of activity. I think politically we are, we are a significant voice in European security. You've seen the role I mentioned, what's going on in Ukraine. We're a significant voice in the European response to that, as well as the global response to that. I think there's many different ways. I mean, each member of the international community, brings its own strengths, and I think our greatest strength is when we all come together, and we saw that, for instance, in what I think was a very strong statement from the Peace Implementation Council Steering Board in December on the 30th anniversary of Dayton. Together, with our different strengths, we can actually do the most to support this country moving forward. But I do need then just to sort of frame that with, but we're the support act. This country can only be run and delivered and progress delivered by the leadership of this country, so the domestic political scene. And there, I think we still have a role in encouraging a more strategic focus on benefit for citizens. And
when speaking about Peace Implementation Council, Office of High Representative, you mentioned as recently, and I mean when speaking about the closure of OHR, there is the so-called 5+2 agenda. And it was set in 2008. 17 years later, that remains unfulfilled. And at the same time, the European Union says Office of High Representative must close before Bosnia can join. Doesn't that create a structural trap where the crisis that justifies Office of High Representative's existence is also the crisis that prevents its closure?
I don't see it like that, no. I think it's perfectly possible to have rapid progress towards alignment with EU standards and movement towards EU membership, which by the very nature of the process will lead to the fulfilment of the 5+2 agenda, which will enable the desired, by everybody, closure of OHR. I think the key thing, though, you mentioned the 5+2 agenda, the key thing there is actually fulfilling the commitments, not setting a timeline. The sooner the better. Nobody thought there would still be international supervision 30 years after Dayton. And it's 17 years, as you say, since the 5+2 agenda was set. Now is the time to be cracking on with those issues which remain, which include really tough issues like state property, which are really beginning to kick in and impact on the levels of investment in this country. So a failure to resolve state property, a failure to reach compromise on very difficult issues, but nevertheless perfectly solvable issues, means that, you know, Corridor 5C, the Southern Interconnector, big investments into energy can't legally happen anywhere in this country. And when you actually look at the billions of euros, pounds and dollars which are being blocked from coming into this country by a failure to reach political agreement on something which should have been sorted out 20 years ago, it's shocking.
Let's move to October 26 and general elections. The last elections in 2022 were followed by the most serious crisis since the war. The High Representative has imposed elections integrity reforms, but the fundamental political dynamics in the country, ethno-nationalist parties are still using the state institution as, I would say, patronage networks. This political dynamics didn't change. What does the UK want to see from those elections in October 26?
Fundamentally, we'd like to see the will of the citizens, the will of the voters, properly expressed in the results and then the actions that follow from those results. So to unpack that a little bit, you mentioned election integrity. It's incredibly important that the election integrity technologies, which were funded through a decision of the High Representative last July, that money comes through immediately, and that the Central Election Commission is able to procure the kit which helps deal with some of the problems which we know exist everywhere, and there's sadly no one party is solely guilty of those games. We know that the bigger the parties, the better their machinery for doing that, and what a difference, you know, whether it's ballot scanning or whether it's biometric identity confirmation, you know, the doubts and the problems which led to the Sunday's rerun in 136 polling stations wouldn't have occurred had those technologies been in place before. So you can see there's a clear need there. So I think there's a piece around election integrity and technologies. And I think the second thing about that, when I think about my conversations across the political spectrum, it is often the smaller parties, less well established, that most want to see those technologies to come in, because they know that in the previous format it's extremely difficult to have a true reflection of what every vote meant if you haven't got that kind of technology. If that happens, then I hope that we will see across the spectrum a more pluralistic politics. I think in any country, if one party can claim to represent the entirety of an ethnicity or of a nationality or whatever, you have a problem, because that's saying that people only decide what they need on the basis of ethnicity. And actually, if you look at the full range of the political spectrum in this country, there are plenty of people who are talking about inclusive approaches which would deliver socio-economic change, which would give jobs for all, regardless of their political or their ethnic or their religious affiliation. And I think moving forward to that is entirely compatible with the structures which were set up under Dayton. It is true that, including on the European pathway, there are issues within the Constitution that need to be addressed, but they don't need to challenge the protections which were offered in Dayton. They merely need to move forward.
The HDZ continues to push for electoral law changes, and you met Dragan Čović, emphasized the need for strong institutions. Where does the UK stand on the substance of electoral reform? Is any change better than the status quo, or are some proposals worse than the current system?
Oh, there's definitely good proposals and bad proposals, and I think, and there is clearly a need for further reform, and that reform needs to be tied in my view, with constitutional reform, not least to address successive European Court of Human Rights rulings, because evidently the current system does not give fully equal rights to everyone. And I think the Sejdić-Finci case is the most obvious example of that, though there are multiple others which need addressing. So you need to have a comprehensive approach, but that must not be that, and that required needs to be addressed, but cannot be an excuse for not progressing other issues now. I feel that any time were anyone to be holding progress to ransom over important issues, but nevertheless not exclusive issues, that for me is troubling, because actually it doesn't serve the interest of the citizen.
Many of UK politicians, including your foreign secretary, they said Putin wants the Western Balkans as his next playground, and putting Serbia and Russia Today Balkans broadcast daily into this country or throughout the region. The RS government, we have seen it, treats or targets civil society and independent media. While
not only the RS.
While welcoming state media from Russia. And the UK has invested or spent millions on countering disinformation in this region. Are we winning the information war in Bosnia and the region?
Until the plurality of the population have access to the facts and have access to independent media, I don't think that we can say that we are winning. More needs to be done. I think it's a problem which requires national governments to take the problem more seriously. We spoke at the beginning about the situation for independent media. I don't think the importance of independent media, including media which is critical of government decisions, is sufficiently recognised. And until it is, it's going to be really hard to win that battle. And I think we have to recognise that, I think I would take Russia in particular, they invest a huge amount in pushing out their message. And too little is done to counter that, or even, through licensing. We have our own in the UK Ofcom, which looks at making sure that each station has to put out a multiplicity of views. You can't just peddle one view. We do not see that in some of the information which has been sponsored, and that's looking at traditional media. If you then look at social media, clearly there is a huge amount of disinformation being peddled in that space. And it's really important to push back. And I think whether you're talking about the international community or you're talking about domestic leaders or civil society or independent groups, I do think that we need to see more facts being put out there in ways which are accessible to ordinary citizens in towns, in rural settings, across the country, to actually bring out the commonalities between people. Because I travel, in my 3.5 years, I've travelled a lot around Bosnia and Herzegovina. If I believed everything I was told or everything I heard in the headlines from political leaders across the different parties, I'd be really surprised by what I find. I find, citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina, each of whom has an identity which is also additional to that, but who have a great deal in common with each other, and when no one's looking are mostly getting on with each other extremely well. Of course there are problems, there's problems everywhere, but actually this is a country where most ordinary folk want exactly the same things, listen to remarkably similar music, have very similar interests, have European values. Sometimes I hear talk about, does this group or that group have proper European values? I don't see citizens of this country having any trouble moving to any part of Europe. Indeed, millions live there and are very successful parts of those European societies, because Bosnia and Herzegovina is a central part of Europe. And that sort of overarching Europeanness is much stronger than the differences which are played on in an election year.
Ambassador Reilly, your posting in Sarajevo will eventually end. When it does and you look back, what would you want to be able to say you helped changed in this country?
Well, hope, or could, two different ideas. I think there's two things. An ambassador represents his country, so making absolutely sure that there is a very clear understanding across the whole country that the United Kingdom is a friend of the citizens of Bosnia and Herzegovina and a friend of the country of Bosnia and Herzegovina, and actually we back all peoples, including, regardless of their ethnic or religious background, as members of that country. So getting that message across, which is a message of friendship. Secondly, I think, if I had had even the smallest influence on helping more people see a positive future rather than a dark past, then I'd feel that I'd actually spent my time usefully.
Ambassador Reilly, thank you very much for your time and this interesting conversation. This has been a Touch on Ed podcast. My name is Turčalo. Until next time.